So I'm a 26-year-old male, and I've been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get away from the town and drive deep into the woods as much as I'd like. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give the layout of where we were camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us and an overlook up north. We camped around the middle, between 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad at around 11 a.m. We set up the camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right up next to our campsite and got out of his truck. When he proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite, and the firewood that was just laying around was his. Now, in this particular forest, campsites are a first come, first serve, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us. Of course, being friendly, we said yes, but we didn't know when he said next to us, he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents and vehicles that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, as there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyways. Not long after that, we noticed a white Dodge Dually circling around us. We had an off feeling from this truck, because it had went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area that we were in was quite popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a dead sleep when out in the woods, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolted up and asked my wife, "What the fuck was that?" When about 30 seconds later we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent so that we could see out. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could see a little ways into our campsite. At the moment we saw the white Dodge Dually tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them get out of their trucks, slamming the door and screaming. Then they proceeded to get back in their trucks and drive slowly down the other road that was in front of our campsite. At this point we were terrified, thinking that they would come rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight. Then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off. At this point, we thought that they maybe just were drunk and acting stupid. We didn't call the cops, and we didn't have any signal anyways. We just tried to get back to sleep. The next day, we had to make a beer run for my dad. When we made it out of the camping area and hit the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys. We assumed they were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued down the road. When we got back to our campsites, the cops were leaving after talking with my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into the younger guys' camp while they were hunting and robbed them. The boys walked up on their camp being robbed, and the dually guys pulled guns on the young boys, proceeding to rob them. We think if it hadn't been for the people that camped right on top of us, as strange as it was, that they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was. The people in the white dually were never caught. So, people in the white Dodge Dually, let's not meet, because you might end up with a bullet. Hey everyone. I was scrolling through the stories here when I realized I have a pretty good one. It was pretty scary, but also kind of funny, so forgive me if the tone isn't creepy enough for Let's Not Meet. This incident happened a few years ago when I was a college student in Baltimore, Maryland. I'd found a nice 3rd-floor apartment with 2 friends in a beautiful old building. Being young and naive, we'd often leave the door to our apartment unlocked while we were home, assuming that the building's locking entrance door would do the trick. Of course, unless all the tenants made sure to close it entirely on their way out, that door could remain just ajar enough to not lock. Anyone who's lived in a not-so-great area of a city probably knows where this is going. It was early in the morning, and my housemate had just left for work. I was fast asleep in my bed. I'm a pretty small person, and during the winter I like to cocoon myself head to toe in a lot of thick comforters. Anyways, the first thing I remember is waking up super groggy to the sound of somebody in my room. It was pretty dark, but I could make out a tall, slim figure of a person who was sort of drifting around by the side of my bedroom. In my half-asleep state, I assumed it was just my housemate. We were close and would often borrow things from each other freely, so I figured they were just poking around for something. I promptly emerged from my blanket cocoon and asked in my infamous morning person super cheerful voice, "Can I help you find anything, babe?" The figure turned and jumped about a foot into the air. I realized pretty quickly and with a sinking feeling that it was not my housemate, but instead some tall man I'd never seen in my life. I then realized that he hadn't even known I was in the room at all. He muttered something, I think, about how he thought this was his friend's apartment, and I just kind of stared bewildered and told him, "Oh no, sorry, this is my apartment." It was very surreal, and I don't think I fully realized at that point I was being robbed. With that, he turned and pretty much bolted through the living room. I learned about 10 minutes later that he had grabbed my laptop on the way out, so at least he managed to find something. Suffice to say, lesson learned. We kept all the doors to the place locked up at all times from that day forward. My friends and I still laugh about it, but I can't help but think about how it could have been a much worse situation if A, it wasn't just some guy committing a crime of opportunity, and B, I hadn't scared him off with my skills as the world's most considerate home invasion hostess. Let's not meet again, burglars of Baltimore. But if we do, can I get you anything to drink? I'm a fire investigator for insurance companies. I was on a fire scene in one of the more well-known for being dangerous parts of the city I was in. To give you an idea of where I was, every single house on the block was burnt and boarded up. The house I was in had quite obviously been set afire in 5 different places, no less, and had 4 bullet holes through the front windows, so I was already on edge because I was alone and quite obviously on a crime scene. I was standing in the hallway drawing my diagram of the first floor when I heard voices coming from the front of the house. I immediately froze in place and listened to the 2 men walk along the side of the building and around the back door, and could clearly hear them talking about how the building I was in was set on fire. They moved into a place where I could see them through the ripped out wall, and then I heard something about how that bitch told the cops he set the place on fire. I'm gonna teach her a lesson. What do you mean? This. Dude pulled out a pistol from his back pocket and my blood ran cold. I felt like I was in a movie, or it was just too damn corny. And the guy had this big, cheesy smile on his face, and I'm a completely unarmed 23-year-old in a crime scene listening to 2 guys talk about how they know it was set on fire, one with a gun, and I have no easy way to get out because walking quietly through fire debris with fire boots is fucking impossible. I crouched down and held completely still, hoping on everything that the one with the gun didn't turn his head to his right and see me clearly for about 2 minutes, but God, it felt like an eternity. Finally, a car drove by, and that was loud enough I could try and sneak back to the front door and across the street to my truck. When I got back to the truck, I immediately called my dad. I'm not sure why I didn't call the cops, but cop response time in the area was horribly slow, and I really didn't have any evidence other than what I heard, and that would get laughed at. My dad told me not to go back inside for a while. Well, duh. As I'm talking on the phone, the guy with the gun came around to the front of the house and sat down on the porch for a few minutes and stared at me the whole time, pistol in hand. Easily the most terrifying 10 to 15 minutes of my life. I could have easily shit diamonds at that moment. Eventually, they both left and walked down the street, and I finished my diagram relatively undisturbed. I hope to never meet either of them again.